I walked into my wife's Lavish company branch opening party expecting champagne and congratulations, and instead I got an entire room laughing at me while someone shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear, "The 1-minute man in bed is here." Minutes later, my wife's office lover personally called security and told them to remove the impotent man from the building. I didn't argue. I didn't cause a scene. I simply turned around, walked out quietly, and by the time I reached my car, I had already begun canceling every single payment, every trip, every party expense, and pulling my 70% ownership stake out of that company, a stake worth $97 million. My name is Nathaniel Cross, and this is the story of the night my marriage and my business partnership both ended in the exact same hour. I need to back up and explain how I ended up standing in that ballroom in the first place, because none of what happened that night makes sense without understanding the 12 years that came before it. I met my wife, Isabel, when we were both 26, fresh out of graduate school, both hungry and ambitious in that particular way young people are before life has had a chance to complicate things. I came from a background in finance, she came from marketing, and together we built a boutique consulting firm from absolutely nothing, working out of a shared apartment for the first 2 years, taking on clients nobody else wanted because nobody else would take the risk. The business worked, genuinely worked, better than either of us had honestly dared to hope. Within 8 years, our firm had grown from 2 people at a kitchen table into a respected consulting agency with offices in 3 cities and a client roster that included several recognizable names. I handled the financial architecture of the business, the investments, the structural growth decisions, while Isabel became the face of the company, brilliant at client relationships, charismatic in a way that made people trust her almost instantly. We split ownership 70-30 in my favor, a structure we'd agreed on years earlier because I'd put in the initial capital that got the whole thing off the ground, though honestly, for most of our marriage, that split never felt like it mattered much, because we operated like true partners in every sense of the word. Somewhere around year 10 of our marriage, though, I started noticing a shift in Isabel, subtle at first, the kind of thing you almost talk yourself out of seeing because the alternative feels too painful to consider. She started spending significantly more time at the office, which I initially chalked up to the company's continued growth, especially once we began seriously discussing opening a 4th branch location. She grew closer to a man named Preston Hale, a sharp, charming senior director we'd brought on 2 years earlier to help manage client acquisition for the new branch expansion. I liked Preston, genuinely, when we first hired him. He was talented, hardworking, exactly the kind of person our growing company needed. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for the rest of this story. I started noticing small things over the following year that, individually, meant almost nothing, but together painted a picture I didn't want to look at directly. Isabel started working late more consistently, always with Preston involved somehow in the explanation. Business trips that used to include me as a matter of course suddenly didn't. Physical affection between us, which had always been steady and natural throughout our marriage, slowly cooled into something more distant, more obligatory. I confronted Isabel gently about it, maybe 8 months before that opening party, asked her directly if something was going on between her and Preston. She was furious that I'd even ask, called me insecure, said my paranoia was insulting after everything we built together, that I was projecting my own personal issues onto her professional relationships. I remember feeling genuinely ashamed of myself after that conversation, wondering if I really was being unfair, if years of quietly working behind the scenes while she took the spotlight had made me irrationally suspicious of the very thing that had always made our partnership work. So I let it go, mostly, told myself I'd misread things, focused instead on the financial structuring for the new 4th branch, which, as the primary majority owner, I was still deeply involved in, even as Isabel and Preston increasingly took the lead on the public-facing side of the launch. The branch opening party itself was, By every external measure, a massive success before anything went wrong. We'd rented out an entire ballroom downtown, brought in nearly 200 guests, clients, staff, local business figures, the kind of lavish celebration meant to announce that our firm had officially arrived as a major player in the industry. I remember feeling genuinely proud walking in that evening, 12 years of work standing right there in front of me in the form of chandeliers and champagne towers and a room full of people celebrating something Isabel and I had built together from a shared apartment table. If you've ever walked into a room expecting to celebrate something you helped build, only to realize everyone there already knew something devastating that you didn't, I think you already understand exactly what the next 10 minutes of that evening felt like for me. And if this story is already pulling you in, subscribe now, because what happened next, and what I did in the hours immediately following, is honestly the part of this story people message me about the most. I noticed the shift in the room almost immediately, a strange energy, people glancing at me and then quickly looking away, small clusters of guests whispering behind champagne glasses. I assumed, at first, it was just typical event nervousness, staff worried about logistics, nothing unusual for a launch this size. But then I heard it clearly, a voice from somewhere near the bar, not even bothering to whisper, loud enough to cut straight through the ambient noise of the party, laughing as they said it, "The 1-minute man in bed is here." I felt my whole body go cold, standing there in the middle of that crowded ballroom, 12 years of building something real suddenly collapsing into a single, humiliating sentence I somehow understood immediately had come from Isabel herself, some private, intimate joke she'd apparently shared with people who were not supposed to know anything about our private life, now weaponized into public entertainment at my own expense. I hadn't even fully processed that moment when Preston Hale, standing near the entrance with a security radio clipped to his jacket, the kind event staff used to communicate during large functions, walked directly toward me and, in front of at least a dozen nearby guests, said clearly into that radio, "Get this impotent man out of here," gesturing toward me like I was some uninvited stranger causing a disturbance rather than the majority owner of the very company whose grand opening we were all attending. I want to explain something about myself here, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I have never, in my entire adult life, been someone who reacts loudly in the moment. Some part of me, even standing there completely humiliated in front of 200 people, some of them major clients whose respect I'd spent over a decade carefully earning, went very quiet and very still, the same kind of calm I imagine soldiers describe feeling right before something enormous happens. I didn't argue with Preston. I didn't demand an explanation from Isabel, who I could see now, standing near the stage, watching the whole scene unfold with an expression I can only describe as mild, distant amusement, like she was watching something happening to someone else entirely rather than her own husband of 12 years. I simply turned, walked calmly toward the exit, past the security staff Preston had actually summoned, out through the grand entrance doors, and into the cool night air outside. By the time I reached my car in the parking garage across the street, I had already pulled out my phone and called my attorney, a precise, no-nonsense man named Harold Whitfield who had handled the company's legal structuring since almost the very beginning. It was nearly 10 at night, but Harold picked up immediately, because he'd known me long enough to understand that a call at that hour meant something serious. I gave him clear, specific instructions. Freeze every company payment authorization tied to my signature effective immediately, including the remaining balance owed for that evening's event. Cancel the corporate credit lines funding the upcoming international client retreat scheduled for the following month. And begin, formally and immediately, the legal process of exercising my rights as majority shareholder to initiate a full ownership restructuring, effectively pulling my 70% stake, valued at that point at just over $97 million, out of active company control. I want to be honest about something here, because I know some people listening might wonder if this was simply an emotional overreaction in the heat of a humiliating moment. It wasn't, not really. That structural authority had always technically been mine, sitting quietly in the background of our partnership for over a decade, something I'd simply never had a reason to exercise, because for most of our marriage and our business partnership, exercising it would have felt like betraying someone I trusted completely. That trust, as it turned out, standing alone in a parking garage with the sound of that ballroom's laughter still ringing in my ears, no longer existed. Within about 20 minutes of that call to Harold, my phone started lighting up, first a handful of missed calls, then, by the time I reached my house across town, 56 missed calls total, most from Isabel, several from Preston, a few from other senior staff members who had clearly just been informed that the financial foundation of the company they worked for had suddenly, dramatically shifted beneath them. I didn't answer any of them that night. I sat alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen Isabel and I had renovated together 6 years earlier during better times, and I simply let the phone buzz on the counter, processing everything that had happened over the past few hours, 12 years of partnership and marriage unraveling in the span of a single evening. Isabel showed up at my door around midnight, still in her party dress, mascara slightly smudged, genuinely panicked in a way I honestly hadn't seen from her in years. She didn't lead with an apology for the humiliation at the party, notably. She led with panic about the financial freeze, about what pulling my stake meant for the branch opening, for the client retreat, for the company's cash flow in the coming weeks. It took several minutes of that conversation, standing in my doorway at midnight, before she finally, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the actual reason I might be upset in the first place. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what happened over the following months, both to the company and to Isabel and Preston personally, honestly surprised even me. I told Isabel, standing calmly in that doorway, that I wasn't interested in discussing company logistics with her at midnight after being publicly humiliated by her and her office lover in front of 200 guests. I told her that whatever existed between her and Preston was, at this point, entirely her business, but that my $97 million ownership stake was, and had always been, entirely mine, and that I no longer had any interest in funding a company culture that thought mocking me privately with intimate details of our marriage, then publicly humiliating me at our own branch launch, was acceptable behavior. The following months were genuinely difficult for the company. Without my financial backing and structural oversight, several major client contracts that had been contingent on the stability of the ownership structure quietly began pulling out, spooked by the sudden, public instability at the top. Preston, as it turned out, had been quietly positioning himself for a promotion to co-managing partner even before that party, a position that, without my ownership stake anchoring the company's finances, became essentially meaningless within about 4 months, as the 4th branch launch collapsed entirely and 2 of the original 3 locations were forced into significant downsizing just to stay solvent. Isabel and Preston's relationship, from what I later learned through mutual former colleagues, didn't survive the financial collapse either, which honestly didn't surprise me much by that point. Preston moved on to a competing firm within the year, and from what I understand, made sure to distance himself from the collapse he played no small part in causing. As for me, I used a portion of that $97 million stake to start something new, smaller intentionally this time, a boutique advisory firm built around exactly the kind of quiet, foundational financial work I'd always genuinely loved doing, without the pressure of maintaining a public-facing brand built around a marriage that, it turned out, had been hollowed out for longer than I wanted to admit. Isabel and I finalized our divorce about 7 months after that party, and while the process was painful in the way any ending after 12 years inevitably is, I remember feeling, more than anything else, a strange, quiet relief once it was finally done. I think about that ballroom sometimes, the laughter, that voice near the bar, Preston's radio call ordering security to remove me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience at my own company's launch. I don't think about it with anger anymore, mostly, I think about it with a kind of clarity I probably needed years earlier. 12 years of quietly working behind the scenes while someone else took the spotlight can feel like partnership right up until the moment it becomes clear it was actually just permission. Permission that, once withdrawn, revealed exactly how much of what we'd built together had only ever really belonged to one of us in the first place. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Sometimes the quiet power you've held all along, the kind you never intended to actually use, turns out to be exactly what protects you the moment you finally need it most. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming every week, honest, real, and sometimes surprising in ways you don't expect. Thank you for listening to mine.